So, a warm welcome to Art and Social Impact, where we're aiming to explore the question of art and social change in discussion with artists whose work has a social impact dimension. I'm joined by Andre Daughtry, Micah Pennell, Nicola Ravenscroft, and Hannah Rose Thomas, and I'll be discussing with them aspects of their personal journeys in addressing issues of social concern, the approaches that they use within their art, and their expectations in terms of the impact that art is able to have on wider society. We'll also be looking to explore ways in which churches can engage with art of this nature, particularly in raising awareness with congregations and wider. So the format that we're planning to use is about 40 minutes of facilitated discussion between our panel, beginning with each artist giving a brief introduction to their work. And that will then be followed by further conversation involving us all, picking up questions and comments that you have made in the chat. So feel free to post any comments or questions that you have in the chat as soon as they occur to you. Feel free to use the chat to discuss what's going on and what's being said with each other. And once we reach that point in our session, I'll seek to pick up your comments and questions from the chat, and we'll explore those together with our panel. We are recording at least the first half of this workshop, so please ensure that you're on mute, as that helps to minimize background noise and assist us with the recording. We do record in speaker view, so that should ensure that you don't appear on screen. But if you want to make doubly sure that you don't appear inadvertently on the recording, then you can turn off your video, and that's absolutely fine. This workshop is part of Living God's Future Now, which is the ongoing Heart Edge Festival of Theology and Ideas, and my colleague Ben will be posting information about Heart Edge and upcoming events in the chat as we go through. Now, this workshop has been inspired by the display of Nicola Ravenscroft's sculpture installation called With the Heart of a Child at St Martin in the Fields. And the installation can be seen behind Nicola, and it aims to inspire us to do whatever it takes to find solutions to avert Earth's climate catastrophe. So I wonder, Nicola, if you could tell us just a little about your work and its motivations.
Yes, well, hello, first of all, thank you for having us, me and my family here. I thought what I'd do is read a small piece that describes the purpose of this installation in a couple of paragraphs. These little guys are called mud cubs. And as mother and artist, and agonized at the sight of our fractured society, our impending climate catastrophe, and our collective fear, I see also the desperate need for togetherness as power to arrest this. In active response, therefore, I've given birth to an international army of little leaders, eco-earthling warriors, mud cubs with the heart of a child. We are all made of spirit, love, and stardust. The mud cubs quietly lead us into recognizing this truth, this universal oneness, our oneness with each other, and our oneness with the earth in all her wild nature, so that in this togetherness, we have the courage to do whatever it takes to find healing for our broken planet, and so to save our children's future. The mud cubs are gentle harbingers. They engage with the inherent life-giving love that we have for our children. and for our earth. And in their strong and silent pleading, the little mudcubs call us all to contemplate and then to respond. So that's kind of like their purpose. And I've got a short film which might interest you to see how they're made and how I produce them. I have a fantastic foundry with whom I work very closely in Wiltshire. It's just outside Andover. And they're very much part of the family. They're my team, and without them, I couldn't do this. So there's a film, Ben, called Profound Resonance.
The peace, the inherent innocence, the raw, unpolluted open-heartedness of young children, this is what captivates and inspires my creativity. A young child draws on our infinite capacity to nurture and to love. And it's in the honesty of these little ones that, as a sculptor, I find my muse. The journey of giving birth to one of these little bronze children, of being able to capture this inherent innocence and peace, however ephemeral, and of being able to preserve it forever in bronze, for me this is a privilege. It is a gift. My role is to identify the characteristic life essence of a particular child, and to work with this unique hallmark to create something telling, captivating, something beautiful. It's a little like writing a melody or writing a song, maybe about a memory. I work my feelings, my understanding, my heart into the clay, breathing life force into this ancient wet earth medium. And then I entrust the piece to my foundry, who, using the ancient ciré perdu, or lost wax method, cast the piece in bronze. There is something close to alchemy in this journey. It involves collaboration, trust, exquisite craftsmanship, and a little magic. The understanding that both clay and bronze originate from deep in our earth, the life-giving joy of working the energies of these ancient materials, and the journey of transmuting them into something that sings hope into the future, all this is quite simply intoxicating. And then there's that still, silent presence that a finished sculpture offers up. It's mysterious, otherworldly almost. It invites a peaceful involvement, an awakening, an intuitive sensing, a shift in consciousness. My finished sculptures are living experiences. They are installations in their own right. They call out for our engagement and participation. They are healing. They are my friends. These little sculptures are timeless treasures. They are fleeting moments frozen. They are small and simple scores, and they are sung with great love.
That's a very beautiful way of beginning our session. Thank you so much to Nicola. We're going to hear next from Andre Dautry, who's a Brooklyn-based interdisciplinary photography and media artist, a filmmaker, a writer, a social activist, and Minister of the Arts at Judson Memorial Church. That's a really fascinating mix. So Andre, do introduce us to your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. First off, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for including me from the other side of the pond. But very happy to be able to join and be in conversation with you over there in Great Britain there. So first I have to say I come to know Jonathan because Jonathan actually wrote, to this day, the best writing that I have seen of my work, and so no one has beat you yet on that, Jonathan. So you're still #1 on there. So when I was asked to be a part of this, I said, of course. Jonathan was able to incorporate aspects of Judson Memorial Church and my work, where I'm based. So a quick history of Judson. It's a church on the south side of Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, and became very famous in the 60s for allowing the artists and the beatniks of the Greenwich Village in the 50s and 60s to be able to present their work. So there was a Judson Gallery. Alan Caporal ran it. He's famous for doing something called Happenings, which is a precursor of performance art. Also, the Judson Dance Theater was formed there, which was the beginning of postmodern dance. So Judson's clergy, from influence from the theologian Paul Tillich, who considered himself to be a theologian of culture, opened up the church and saw that the best way for a church to stay alive and be of relevance is to allow people to come in with their own voices and to be able to participate in what he considered a spiritual community of clergy, congregation, and artists who wanted to come and have a place for free self-expression. So a lot of my work actually deals with how in these multiple secular societies that we live in, how we actually deal with language around things that come out of spiritual traditions, but yet are very much a part of our political speak of today. So for instance, sanctuary cities, with the immigration crisis that we have in America, you could be a sanctuary university campus or a sanctuary church, obviously, that has a sanctuary in it, and sanctuary city. So I'm very into terminology that finds itself a part of the aesthetics of social movements, which leads us to the Poor People's Campaign. I'm wondering if Ben got the link that I sent. If you can put that up, and we can start there. Revival of the 1968 Martin Luther King movement. And it is the campaign that tries to tie in a couple of the, what would be called the evils in an American empire society, dealing with late stage capitalism, the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. And so they had a series of protests in about 34 US capitals. I was part of the New York team, and so we went to Albany, which is about a 3-hour drive north of New York City, and closed down the state capitol for 4 Mondays in a row of protest around the governor's, the capital. And so my interest as someone who has a background in fashion photography and in photojournalism is the aesthetics of movements. And along with dealing with the concerns of the medium of documentary and what those aesthetics are like, I also combine them with my own personal interests of what I just stated before, is the usage of religious traditional ideas or ethics or concepts or terminology that are a part of the movements as well. So as you can see, This protest here is being led by a gentleman of the cloth with the collar. And so those are the photojournalistic photos that I took of the day. But then if you could just scroll up a little bit, Ben, then I invited certain leaders from the, or scroll down, go in the other direction to where the portrait is of Jeff, which is right above that last photo, if you can. I invited the leaders that were prominent, the spiritual leaders that were prominent, thank you, in the movement to come and then do a portrait of them. And so I came with the idea of telling stories of courageous acts that we know by going to the museums of old times that are mixed with spiritual storytelling of biblical characters or of saints of the Middle Ages or earlier. And a lot of those forms come in a form of a triptych. And I like the storytelling aspect of the triptych. And I attempted to create a modern contemporary triptych that tells the story of the American aesthetics and the aesthetics of social movements and social progress in America. So I ultimately decided on the triptych form, which Ben, if you don't mind, just go all the way back up to the top so you can see the full photo of the triptych. Thank you very much. And there it is. I decided, as opposed to some of the more darker medieval kind of woods and aesthetics of the triptych that we're all familiar with, I was inspired by the cabinet making of the Shaker community. And the Shaker community were a celibate, what we could call evangelical movement of the 1800s. So they're not that much around because, as I said, they were celibate. The men and the women lived in different buildings on the campus, but they were socially progressive because their theology thought of a divine that was dualistic, male and female. So there was equal equity in the polity and the politics organization of the Shaker communities. And also the significant thing along with that for me was the cabinet making. One can consider as a proto-minimalist style, which was very much an advance in American cabinet making and aesthetics. So with the three parts of the triptych here, one is the photojournalistic photo, the one in the middle is the portrait, and the one on the left is a time-based portrait. If those can't tell, it's a little blurry there because it's actually a moving image. So there's a monitor that's there. And what I had asked each of the spiritual leaders to do is come and actually sit, and I interviewed them, and I wanted them to speak solely about the aesthetics of the photojournalist photo that I captured them in. So I was very strict. I sent these folks who have gone to grad school through a seminary program, but I brought them through a grad critique program if they were in an art school. And so they had to speak just specifically of the aesthetics itself that they saw in the photo, not giving a narrative. And so I was hoping to be able to bring and draw attention to the spiritual community's awareness of the actual aesthetics of the social movements that they're actually involved in. And then I encapsulated that in the Shaker influenced style framing to be able to show that the Shakers are socially progressive movement, and their understanding of cabinet making with having very minimalist straight lines was their way of having devotion. For them, the busy hands were them always being pious and having a direct line with the divine. And so the very minimalist and direct right angles and long lines were the aesthetic representation for that community of how to actually communicate to the divine. And as abstraction goes, when we get into Alf Klimt, and who was a theosophist, and Wassily Kandinsky and Piet Mondrian, who were theosophists as well, abstraction starts to become which I disagree with, but I understand the argument. Abstraction starts to become the visual analog to the spiritual realm that is tying us all together. So in the triptych, I was really trying to speak of how the aesthetics of social movements and social movements being led from the pulpit, the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, even the creation of the colonies, as you know, many of the Puritans and Pilgrims that escaped from the Anglican control of their spirituality to come to America to find new ways to be able to express their spiritual relationship. That the aesthetics of American progress are also a part of the aesthetics of a church, not one particular church, but of the sense of church and piety at the same time. So that's the beginnings of the Poor People's campaign triptych series. I was only able to have one made. The frames are expensive, and so we're looking for further funding to be able to finish up the series, because there's many more triptychs that I have ready to go. They just have to be fabricated. But that's what I've been recently working on. That's the Poor People's Campaign triptych. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andre, for that tremendous introduction and for showing us the piece that you have created as part of that project. It's wonderful to see. So we're going to hear next from Hannah Rose Thomas, who's an artist who seeks to use art as a powerful tool for advocacy. She's organised art projects with Syrian refugees in Jordan, Yazidi women who escaped ISIS captivity in northern Iraq, Rohingya children in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and survivors of Boko Haram and Fulani violence in northern Nigeria. Hannah, do share with us now something of your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's so wonderful to hear more about your work, Nicola and Andre. Looking forward to the discussion later. I thought I'd share a little bit with you all about my journey using art in trauma healing, but also in advocacy. So I will just share my screen. So ever since I was young, I have always wanted to be a voice for the voiceless somehow, but I never really imagined that this could be through art. It all began really when I was living in Jordan as an Arabic student in 2014, and I had the opportunity to organise an art project with UNHCR, with Syrian refugees. And this experience opened my eyes to the magnitude of the refugee crisis confronting our world today. I found that my understanding of the language, as well as the universal language of art, enabled me to build a connection with the Syrian refugees I had the privilege of working with. And for this project, we turned the symbols of loss and displacement, the refugee tents, into beautiful works of art with groups of Syrian refugees in Jordan. And at this time, I began to paint some portraits of the refugees that I had met. The hope was to show some of the human stories behind the global crisis. For that, I really felt that in the news, often the personal stories are very much shrouded by the statistics. And since this opportunity, I have had the opportunity of organising art projects for Yazidi women who'd escaped ISIS captivity, for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, as well as Christian women in northern Nigeria, survivors of sexual violence at the hands of either Boko Haram or the Fulani militants. For the projects in northern Nigeria and Iraqi Kurdistan, I taught the women how to paint their self-portraits as a way to share their stories with the rest of the world. These art projects created a safe place for the women to share their stories, for telling our stories helps individuals to integrate traumatic memories and gradually begin to heal and reclaim their dignity after they've been hurt. Language is often inadequate to convey the experiences of trauma and conflict. However, the arts can help unlock this process and give a new form of communication to address the silence and unspeakable pain. For many survivors of violence experience a profound sense of powerlessness, an overwhelming and deeply rooted feeling that they do not have a voice. Thus, one of the primary needs of survivors is to feel like a person again, to rediscover their sense of personhood and voice. And so the hope was that these art projects would create a safe space that honours the experience and the women's stories, and therefore enable a restoration of dignity. For as John Paul Lederach writes, that art and finding our way back to humanity are connected. So in August 2017, that was when I travelled to Iraqi Kurdistan for the art project with a group of Yazidi women who'd escaped ISIS captivity. And you may recall the headlines in 2014 when the plight of the Yazidis became global news, with thousands stranded on Mount Sinjar having fled ISIS. Those unable to flee were taken captive. One of the Yazidi women who took part in the project, called Hadia, had been sold to 12 different men during her time in captivity. And Hadia and I are the same age, just 25 years old at the time. And yet how different our lives have been. So the project was based at a rehabilitation centre in Dohuk in Iraqi Kurdistan. And many of the women chose to paint themselves in the white robes of Yazidi traditional dress. And this expression of identity is especially important considering the dehumanization that they have endured. Though many chose to paint tears of gold to convey their grief for loved ones lost or still in captivity. One young mother, Bassey, painted this haunting image of an ISIS soldier separating her from her 6-year-old daughter. She said, "They took her out of my hands and put her in the hands of the enemy. Every day and night I imagine what Daesh or ISIS are doing to her." So Bassey escaped, but her daughter did not. During the project, the women also asked if I would paint their portraits, which felt an incredible privilege to be trusted to share their stories in this way. So following my return from Iraqi Kurdistan, I poured my heart into painting a series of portraits. I hope to capture something of their strength and dignity and resilience, and to show that these women have not been defined by what they have suffered. For these paintings, I chose to use sacred imagery, gold leaf and egg tempera painting techniques that were used for paintings of the Virgin Mary during the early Renaissance, also known as the Mater Dolorosa or Mother of Sorrows. Because Mary, like these Yazidi women, also knew what it means to be poor, oppressed, a refugee, and for her heart to be pierced with grief for the loss of her beloved son. So these paintings, like those of the Mater Dolorosa, seek to emotionally engage the viewer and inspire compassion, and are also meditations on the universal experience, human experience of suffering. For in these portraits, we capture a glimpse of the Yazidi women's unspeakable grief, but is also a reminder that we all face grief, sorrow, and loss at different times in life. We are not so different. We are inextricably connected to one another. Then, after this experience, I had the opportunity to travel to northern Nigeria with Open Doors for an art project, part of a trauma healing program for Christian women, survivors of sexual violence, either at the hands of the militant Fulani herdsmen or the Islamic extremist group Boko Haram. Each woman who took part in this project also had a heartrending story. So the hope was to create that safe space for them to be seen, heard, and accepted and begin to process their trauma. By the end of the project, each woman had painted a powerful self-portrait, for the finishing touch sewing vibrant Nigerian fabric onto their designs. And like the Yazidi women, they also chose to paint glistening tears of gold. So conflict leaves many wounds, but perhaps the biggest of all is the stigma that so many survivors face. This additional burden following devastating assaults is almost too painful to contemplate. A one-woman charity, whose portrait you can see here, had been kidnapped by Boko Haram and held captive for 3 years, and she came back with a child, and she recounted that she was beaten 3 different times by her husband because she came back with a child. And she said, "I haven't done it of my own will, I was forced and there was nothing I could do." And so her pain was magnified by this rejection and the abuse that she suffered in the refugee camp that she lived in northern Nigeria as well, due to the stigma. But on our last day together, Charity said, "I am so happy. I have never held a pencil in my life before. And this is the first time that I've been able to write my name and even to draw my face. The art project is but a drop in the ocean when I think of the trauma that these women have faced. Nevertheless, the simple process of painting a self-portrait helped the women to find their voice, to know their worth and affirm their identity. The women said that sharing their stories together helped them to realise for the first time that they were not to blame and did not need to be ashamed. Telling our stories helps us to integrate these traumatic memories and reclaim our dignity after we've been hurt. For as Desmond Tutu says, it is our shared humanity, our shared losses, and our shared grief that ultimately allow us to reconnect again with the world around us. We are harmed together, but we heal together. So by the end of the project, the women were all laughing and singing and dancing together, which was a complete transformation from the first day, which was so beautiful to see. And when I returned, I also painted a series of portraits of the Nigerian women, and these were shown alongside my paintings in juxtaposition to enable their voices to be heard. So the purpose of these projects was both therapeutic and for the women, but also for advocacy, to empower the women's voices to be heard through their self-portraits. The women's self-portraits have been shown alongside my portraits in places including the House of Parliament, the European Parliament, Buckingham Palace, Lambeth Palace and Westminster Abbey, to shine a light on the issues of sexual violence and the persecution of religious minorities. As such, the women are being a voice for other women who are also targeted on account of their religion and their gender. For all too often, their stories of suffering remain unseen and unheard. I believe that the creative arts can be a powerful way to speak out against injustice, for art can touch the emotional core of what moves us towards social justice and compassion in ways that news or political analysis cannot. The arts affirm the language of empathy. They can provide us with a language for mediating the broken relational and cultural divides. Art can be emotive or effective and thereby make meaningful the suffering of others. It can help bridge divides through creating empathy based upon shared humanity, counteracting a fear of the unknown and other, reminding us that we have more in common than what divides us. Thank you.
And thank you, Hannah. These are deeply moving projects and deeply moving portraits. Thank you so much for coming and sharing them with us. We've pulled together a panel whose work is very varied and addressing a whole range of different kinds of social issues. So we're going to hear finally from Micah Pennell, whose fly posters, billboards, street signage and flyers act as antidotes to the ubiquity of commercial messages and attempt to redeem advertising space for a broader discussion about how we create value. So Micah, please do introduce us to your work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I'm not sure that was enough to follow what we've just seen from everybody so far. That's pretty powerful, hey? I think we should just go home now. There's enough there for me to be going on with. My work just seems really like a few tins of paint against a brick wall compared to this. But it is what it is. It feels a little bit insensitive almost, but I'll crack on and show you some of the stuff that I've been doing. I'll do a screen share and let's see where we end up. Let's have a look. So I'll move that over there and let's go. Okay, so that's me Googling myself to see if the internet loves me, and me maybe 20 years ago, acting like a young punk. I am both an artist and a graphic designer. I studied graphic design and I studied art, and my art teacher said I was too graphic-y and my graphics teacher said I was too arty. True story. So I kind of straddle these two spaces. I always have done. For the last 20 years, I've been on both sides. And I think for a time when I came out of college, I didn't think art was very cool. So I called myself a graphic designer, and I was doing more graphic design, and then I was getting more art projects. So I called myself an artist, and graphic design kind of dropped out. And then I was getting a bit of both. I didn't know what to do with my website. So I put myself as a graphic designer website. I have 2 websites. And then I merged them, and then I split them, and then I merged them again. And I still don't know, but I'm putting artist first on the list there, because I think that's probably correct. Let's see what else we've got. So the graphic designer, just a couple of slides, probably be quite brief. So yeah, that'll be logos, branding, advertising, for projects, art projects, books. I love making books. This is from my old photography tutor who did a body of work on masculinity around the chopper and biker culture. It's a really fascinating piece of work. And I was able to play a little bit there. You can see the bottom left corner, the pages are folded in such a way that you can't open them, or at least you can't open half of them. But there's content on the inside, which is a reference to these hidden emotions that probably men, and certainly men in the biker culture, maybe hide on the outside pages of the performance. So this is me working with other artists and trying to honour their work, even down to choosing the right cloth, as you can see bottom left there, or the end papers, the cover design, even down to you know, the page layout. So I'll do all of that. I'm kind of all over the show. I think what we've seen so far is each person showing us one piece of work, which has really kind of shown what they do really well, but I'm kind of a bit scatty, so I'm a bit all over the show. A bit of advertising for a homeless prevention charity, which was last Christmas. And then onto the artwork. I do a few different bits and bobs, so I have a couple of billboards, and I've been doing this over the years and not really knowing what my kind of role was, not really having a real tunnel vision purpose, and that was fine by me. I just kind of chipped away, keep doing what I was doing. Didn't really have, I didn't feel like I had any drive, but I did have a drive for production, so I just produced work and put it out. And slowly over time, I think a few years ago I read Another Kingdom by Walter Brueggemann and Peter Block, and they kind of hit onto something that I realized I'd been covering, which was the 4 pillars of capitalism, as told by Peter Block, are privatization, perfection, scarcity, and certainty. And the Old Testament alternatives being the common good, common ground, common place, fallibility, abundance, and mystery. So these are the things I've been tackling all this time without really realizing, and they were able to give it some language for me. So the AdArt is a billboard that I have. I'm always working to find spaces for new billboards. I'm working on something at the moment for a couple more. Belonging Project is something I do with another curator we work together on, alongside a church. Selling Virtues is something different that asks for the advice of a sociologist, a psychologist, and a philosopher to tell us what we need to live well. And then we get some big ad agencies to create artwork that answers those questions, and we put that on the billboard, and then we have a panel conversation, a publication. That all stopped during COVID, but hopefully when things settle down, we can bring that together. And the last is the first billboard that I put together in Manchester, which is still going under a different name. And there you go. So here's a couple. It's my head in a taxi. So a Japanese photographer, as I'm putting up there, and Andrew Ray. On the right, that's Moonhead. I really like this piece because it's really light-hearted. Moonhead is a coming-of-age book. It's really sweet. He's just like some kid. He's off to school. He gets there. He realizes he's forgotten his head. So he has to go back, get his head, go back to school again. I just like that kind of chilled out sort of look on his, on his demeanor as we're all rushing around doing our thing. The Belonging Project is something that's currently ongoing. We started this before COVID, but as COVID hit, we tweaked it a little bit. So it was created, this website, so that people could answer the question about their feelings of belonging anonymously. So we tweaked it to belonging during isolation. And some of the responses were pretty profound, some were funny. And I think because they're anonymous, they're just honest, they're really short, sweet. That's me saying I've done 5 minutes, but I'll just finish off. Yeah, and people had told me that, having looked through at people's responses, that they felt validated of their feelings. Some were introverts and loved it. It was their normal. Some were extroverts and were struggling, and so on and so forth. So we put them on the flags, and they were up until Christmas outside for people to go and see on their daily walk in the city. There's another piece. So this is kind of the public messaging. This is me trying to change the narrative of the city, given the amount of ads we see, trying to encourage their end, greed and envy and so on and so forth. And during COVID, I saw so much positive community, at least in my village, in my street, that it spurred me on to create this kind of work, which got picked up. I was just banging it out onto Instagram and different places, and people spotted it, passed it on to other people, and then ended up going on the streets and on a 10-story billboard there, which is nice. I think that's still running in the city. Simon Sinek says that it's great if we can encourage people to unite towards a positive future rather than a current problem. I think there's a place for both, but in the past I probably tried to unite people to a negative, and I don't know whether that's always been the best thing. So different ways of looking at it and different ways of doing things. And this is a current piece that's up in the centre of the university district here in Manchester. Bit bold, I guess. This was their choice of words, but even so, a great piece in the midst of difficulty to have something settling like that. It's quite nice. I have other slides that I might come back to later on, but I think that's probably enough from me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Micah. A really broad introduction to the breadth of your work there, and a very broad range of work, approaches and social issues being explored and tackled by our panel today. Do remember to post your questions or any comments that you have in the chat while we continue this exploration of issues and approaches a bit further with our panel, and then we'll come and pick up your comments and questions. So if you want to explore the work of any of these artists in more detail, then do put those comments and questions in the chat. If you want to explore the way in which churches can engage with this kind of work, then again, do put your comments and questions there in the chat for us to pick up. But to continue our thoughts a little bit further, I want to ask our artists if they could tell us about responses that they've had to their work, both from those who've been directly affected by the issues that they're exploring, and perhaps also from those among whom you hope to raise awareness. Is there any one of you that would like to kick us off with the kind of reactions and responses that you've had from your work?
I'm missing you. I'm missing what you're saying. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll try again.
That's better.
Yeah. So could you tell us about responses to your work, both from those directly affected by the issues that you explore and also from those among whom you hope to raise awareness.
Well, I can say that you can have a targeted response that you are expecting, and then the multiple responses that people take away. But the one thing that I'm proud of is that the actual clergy and leaders of the Poor People's Campaign, after me putting the triptych together, because just to explain my relationship with the New York Poor People's Campaign is I'm a former student of Union Theological Seminary, and the one half of the Poor People's Campaign is actually based in Union, and so I did photography that was to be used for their website. So I did very photojournalistic photos that they use on their website. But coming to seeing what I did with the triptych, it allowed for more concentration from the organizers and the clergy of actually what does that mean to take aesthetics into consideration. And because when we really think about movements, the hands up for the Black Lives Matters, or the two gentlemen who put the Black Power fist up at the Olympics in the 60s, different movements have an aesthetic takeaway. And I do believe that responses from those who participated in the project were able to engage with aesthetics, which they weren't thinking of because they're thinking of policy and organizing, but they have a deeper sense of that the aesthetic function is one that also tells the story of the movement outside of just the organization itself. So that's a direct outcome, that people who are organizers are thinking more aesthetically of the takeaway at the end of the day of the photo. But I needed to put it into a form. People walk into a gallery and expect to see things that transform them, but they don't necessarily pick up a newspaper and think that of images. So restaging these photojournalistic images along with the portrait and the time-based portrait, and then showing it in the gallery in a triptych space, to create the environment for people to engage aesthetically where they might not have really thought of the significance of the aesthetics of a social movement in the first place.
There was one, can I interrupt, Andre? There was one, I was looking at your work just yesterday, and somewhere I read about the white of the road and the sky in that particular image, and that the movement was a river. Is that, am I right?
Well, that was the aesthetic response from Reverend Jeff.
Okay,
and
that's what it was. It was the movie.
Yeah. And so
I got that. I understood that because that was drawing people in, which as a sculptor is what I the whole of my being is to do with engaging the viewer, and the response that the viewer gives to the piece, to the work, is actually as much the work as the muse, whatever I've done in the beginning. And so I really related to that. That was actually my response to your piece of work. So for what it's worth.
Yeah, thank you.
And Hannah, if you would like to come in on this question, because your work is very directly working with those affected by the issues around which you're seeking to raise awareness.
Yeah, so well, for the paintings, for the art projects with the women, I definitely, well, they spoke of having come to the art project with heavy hearts and leaving filled with joy. That was one of the quotes that I remember coming away with in northern Nigeria, which was so deeply moving to hear that something so small could have such an impact and on their lives. I remember there was one young girl called Florence. She'd been raped by Fulani militants when she was 9 years old. She was 12 when she took part in the project. It had been a couple of years ago. But she said that during the art project, she had found peace of heart. And you could really see the difference. At the beginning, she wouldn't have eye contact, she wouldn't look at you, she kept her face covered. She wasn't really engaging, but by the end, she'd lifted the veil, she was smiling and so proud of her painting as well. So that was, it felt so small, but also so it felt like it was worth going all the way to northern Nigeria if it just made a difference in the life of this one girl. But when the paintings have been shown in places like Parliament or GCHQ and other places, I've been really surprised by how moved people have been by the paintings. Some people moved to tears even just to see the self-portraits and the portraits side by side with the women's stories. I guess it's a way it really brings you face to face with the human reality of these atrocities, of these conflicts. So it makes it much more tangible. And so that has been profoundly moving to see those responses, I think, in the places that have been shown, in the hope that would then influence policy as well, and moving people to compassion, to be moved to want to do something about it. Yeah, so does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So before we come to the questions that are in the chat, let's just think for a moment about some of the ways in which churches have engaged with your work. And maybe if we could go to Micah first on this one. I know you mentioned the Belonging Project, and that's a project that has shown work within churches in Manchester. How have you found churches reacting and responding to your work?
Well, St Anne's in the city centre are really good with it. So I've not got a massive amount of work alongside churches. Not so many, just put here and there. But I think when they've got an appreciation of the arts, and it makes things easier, and they kind of enable the artist to do their thing, or the artist has a body of work that they can use and work with, then they take to it really well, and it can be used to kind of as a springboard to further conversations. There's what else have I got on here? I'll just do another quick screen share. This body of work, which was in St Anne's as well. There's a chap there taking a photo. It's from Seattle, actually, but he was taking a photo because he was sending it to somebody. So it's these ideas of art and social change, and I think the idea is that you share something that maybe people hadn't spotted before, and then hopefully the ideas spread and spread and spread in however small steps. And I think it's a normalizing sort of thing, maybe. Some change might be drastic and quick, but I think on the whole, and art can add to social change. It's probably more of a drip sort of thing over a long period of time. I'd heard it said that it wasn't Martin Luther King that made those big changes, but centuries earlier there was conversations that were just had when they saw something wrong and they talked about it, and then somebody else did something off the back of that conversation, and somebody saw what was done, and it just kept having a kind of a knock-on effect until you've got a movement and then a figurehead and so on and so forth. So quantifying things is a really tricky thing, but when you get things being shared, I think that's I'll stop rambling.
Thank you. And I wonder if we could go to Andre on that one, because obviously you're based at Judson Church, and as you were explaining, it's a church that has this incredible track record of working with innovative artists. So what have your experiences of art and church been, Andre?
I think America has a very interesting relationship. You know, when you're in artistic circles, the conversation of spiritual traditions or religion seems to be not a part of contemporary or modernist conversation or postmodernist conversation. But at the same time, you know, especially in New York, there's a very interesting happening that took place as far as because of the need of space, that a lot of art actually contemporary art takes place in churches. The Judson Memorial Church is not the only church that features experimental contemporary dance. There's St. Mark's in the Bowery, which is in the Village as well, around the corner. And there's many churches that are looking for partnering with contemporary artists because there's just so many contemporary artists in New York. So there's many institutions that have created the opening of their spaces, because if a church is seen as a community center, then if the community is made up of artists, which I had mentioned earlier with Judson's story, then that kind of cross-pollination takes place, especially with the dance community. And it's very interesting when you think of dancers, a lot of the breaking of the Cartesian split between mind and body that the dance artists are dealing with and repairing, their openness to rituals of body. So is a strong impetus behind a lot of the contemporary performance art work that you see. So some of my most interesting conversations, if I do bring in the theological to my work, happens a lot with dancers, because dancers are a part of so many different somatic practices, from yoga and Ayurvedic healing and Reiki. So churches have found partners in these different types of arts communities. And it also, you know, with the history of Judson doesn't have any pews. And that's because back in the 60s, when the Judson Dance Theater had their performances, say on a Saturday night, all the wooden pews would be moved to the side to open up the space for performance. And then the next morning for church service, the pews would be put back. Well, that got tiresome after a while, and the congregation, who were also observers of the art, they were audience members of the art on Saturday nights and during the week as well. There was a big worship council. It was in 1962 or 1963, I believe, at Judson, where they decided to get rid of the pews and not just open the space for the performances, but also become experimental in the liturgy that takes place in the church services as well. So I'm coming from a very privileged, for lack of a better word, a position of seeing religion and religious traditions being altered by the arts that come into the space, and vice versa, that artists come into the space and have a new relationship to church that they might have never have thought that they would have had before. I do go to American Academy of Religion every year and try to hang out with many of the theology and the arts folks to try to find if there's some other instances of where that actually happens. And it's not really happening all over the place, even though there's different places that we can say are burgeoning communities of people who have a relationship to a local synagogue or a Buddhist temple, monastery, that kind of thing, and bring art practice along with that. But we're confident enough to call it the Judson model. And the Judson model is going to places. We consulted with a church in Newport, Rhode Island, which has some beautiful stained glass windows by Lafarge, who was the competitor with Tiffany, if people are knowing of Louis Comfort Tiffany. Lafarge was the one who actually invented the opalescent glass, stained glass look that is all through churches and homes in the Gilded Age here in New York, in America. And so a church in Newport, Rhode Island, all of their stained glass windows were done by Lafarge. They had this huge space, and they had a congregation, an elderly congregation of about 8 people. and you have this massive like church space that it's just not really being used. So we consulted with them a few years back, and they got the grant money to get the pews out. And now the local ballet company in Newport, Rhode Island, and the Newport Jazz Festival, these places pre-pandemic were starting to actually use the space. So the church as a beacon of, having the bell to, traditionally letting us know what time it is, or being a shelter if there's a storm. It's also now a new haven for art production to take place. So that Judson model that we've been exporting has been growing. So it's been a very positive relationship at the end of the day for people who are looking for, again, spiritual community, but not necessarily a doctrine. And our openness that we have at Judson, where whenever we have art, we don't sell tickets. Anyone's able to come and see the most contemporary of contemporary artists. And also we serve a meal. So there's a couple of different functions of like creating fellowship and community and taking care of people's bodies, and then opening them up so that their minds are able to explore the art that's being presented in front of them. That in New York has been a very positive thing, and an interaction between people walking off of the street into a church, which they would never really think about or going into, and then being able to see uncensored work that opens them up about immigration, about Black and queer bodies, and all the different subject matter that artists are taking on in New York. They're able to come into these havens of sanctuaries to be able to create these new links through the artist's work and their own moral or ethical relationship to these subject matters, again, are taking place in what traditionally was in pre-modern times the center of where people got some guidance and some light about how to deal with each other in this world.
That's so helpful. Thank you very much, Andre. Moving to the comments in the chat, and the first couple of comments from Kate and Liz were to do with the way in which story or narrative runs through quite a lot of the work that's been presented. Is there anyone that would like to respond to that in terms of the importance of storytelling and narrative within your practice?
I could possibly just say that I find it very powerful that I've put together an installation with 7 children, mud cubs, one representative, each represents a continent, and they're all different. And therefore they're a microcosm, they're the world. And when I've done a certain amount of work with these at Cambridge University. They were unveiled in 2016 in Churchill College, Cambridge, and then they've used them ever since as what they describe as a new arts-based research tool. And they've used the diversity of each child and what they stand for in as much as it's a conversation, a shared conversation that is bringing people together, and they've used them with children as research tools, and the children have engaged with them, and that's been their method of teaching. I was working with the Faculty of Education. So from the narrative perspective, the fact that they are children from every part of the world, so they represent the world, was very, very important. And it was that, I think, that elicited response from not just the children, from the staff as well. And academics were continued on with it. So that was, for me, very relevant. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicola. That's great. Anyone else want to come in on the value of storytelling and narrative?
I totally see the value in it. I think it's really important. I don't know if it's in my work particularly, but I certainly recognize it. There's a book on my shelf called Made to Stick, about urban myths made by two brothers, Dan and Chip Heath. And they looked at they tried to like decode what made urban myths so powerful. And they came up with the acronym of success, and it needed to include these things to have the power to go as far as they do. And simplicity was the first one, something unexpected, which happens a lot in the arts, in comedy, in films. There's a twist in the tale. Something concrete, so visual, not an abstract idea necessarily, but an apple, you can see it. So something concrete, something credible. So an authority might kind of add to it, a doctor or something, or somebody who knows in that area. Emotion and story, and all those put together, which often happen in the arts, create something powerful that aids memory, and it sticks in your mind. And then that is obviously the thing that can move people forward to change.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm going to go to Joyce Simon, who's made a comment about the powerful impact on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa of the arts, graphic arts and posters in particular. So, Joyce, do you want to unmute and just say something more about that comment?
Well, in the 80s, I was engaged in advocacy here in the US around South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, and I met some Africans, and also I'm blanking on his name, a leading clergy figure in the movement, and it was he who reported the impact of art on that movement. I have not read more about that, but I was struck by his observation of the power of art in the movement. I'd appreciate it if anybody else has seen material resources on that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But
so I wonder if any of our panel have been inspired by examples of art and protest from other settings and other artists.
I could tell you about something quickly. There's an artist that I follow. I really admire his work. I'm going to find it. I'm just scrolling on my screen and then I'll screen share. So yeah, this guy's called Anthony Burrell. We've had him on one of our billboards before. And I saw this thing pop up on Instagram a couple of weeks ago, and it reminded me that I wanted to do the same. So let me get this here and share, and you can see this piece here, which is in Leeds and has just happened very recently. And I just thought, oh, brilliant, I really want to do that. I've wanted to do a wall like that, and it just got me going, emailing all my contacts, who's got a wall, any chance I can paint it. And I remember that these guys here, you can just see the first letters, Inspire, actually asked me to paint that wall once, and it didn't end up working out, but I got back in touch and said, have you still got that wall? And they said, yeah. So we're working in the hope that we can do something, and I'll work with them with the words and what we come up with. Initially I just said, what about You Are Enough, or something like it. And he was like, yeah, maybe we can come up with something and we can all work together. They can get some volunteers, we can all paint, they can come up with some ideas, and we can create a setting that works. It's not actually their wall, it's the brothel's wall, but the brothel don't mind them using the wall. So it's a nice little piece that hopefully we can make happen this year, but we'll see.
Andre, you've done a beautiful piece. Was it called Wait?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was very powerful. The imagery projected onto the body. Very good.
Thank you.
It spoke to me.
Thank you. For me, I would say inspiration. I did research of photography from the original Poor People's Campaign, but that was more of just research of what ground had been covered by photography. Um, but I actually am still very inspired by Romanticist painters, Géricault and Delacroix, and looking at those images of the French Revolution. Um, there's a it's a Romanticist movement. It's not neoclassicism, but there's a classical element, how things are staged, and so I think very much of that when I'm actually shooting the photojournalist aspects, the stuff that's out in the street. I'm trying to grab photos that seem monumental as opposed to just capturing the moment. And so I do have compositions that are always in my head that I'm referencing when actually capturing what is out there. And those references still seem to come from those kind of like grandiose paintings that you would see at the Louvre of big social unrest, like I said, of Delacroix. So those are the ones that I'm always playing with and inspired by, because they're trying to evoke emotion of the scenes as opposed to just stating the news of the scene. And I think that me mixing the fashion background and the photojournalist kind of makes me look for a form of monumentalizing that, paying attention to some of these grander compositions helps me along with evoking emotion of protest, as opposed to just what the protest is about at the end.
The silent language.
Yeah.
Universal language.
We've got a couple of questions from June Boyce Tillman and Anderson Marsh. They're about churches and their external walls and spaces. So June was asking, should churches make their external walls available for challenging through art in the way that perhaps Micah was just showing us an example of? Obviously not in church setting, but it could be. And Anderson was asking about, or saying he's interested in how we light up buildings and using buildings as a canvas, projecting images onto them and using them to tell stories. So any thoughts or examples around use of buildings within artwork?
I know St Anne's has had all sorts of projections on their building. I think after I didn't see this, but after the attack at the Manchester Evening News Arena where 22 people lost their lives, they had giant word projections. I think there were word projections directly onto the building. And that's I think once you got the equipment and somebody to work it, it can be quite cost effective, I guess, which is obviously something that always comes into play when trying to do something. But yeah, I mean, churches are kind of known, aren't they, for having notice boards, and that kind of is what kind of kickstarted my work, is the notice boards that, you know, I saw as a kid growing up. There was one in the city centre, a Quaker building that just had a great anti-war slogan on it in black and white, nothing fancy. But yeah, up and down the country they've got notice boards, but you know how you use them. They've got walls, they've got buildings. So ideal opportunities really to work with that and change the narrative. And you can put what you want on there, can't you? You can work with artists, you can work with the congregation, you can work with themes, you can change it monthly, you know, it can roll and change and yeah, and hopefully have an impact for the better.
Okay, and Alison Wilson has added a comment about murals in Belfast. Alison, do you want to unmute and just say something more about those?
It was really to Micah, in response to what he'd said about the painting on walls, and whenever he said that he'd seen a wall, I want a wall like that to paint on, I immediately thought of Belfast being known for having lots of different murals, and particularly in the past for the very sectarian ones. And you could tell if somebody were to take you blindfolded and then present you in front of a wall, which part of Belfast are you in, going just by whatever mural you were in front of. But there are so many now that are really works of art about all sorts of historical things and cultural things, different people from Northern Ireland, and different styles of art, but really worth a look. You can actually, well, presumably not now, but you could go on tours that were just to visit lots of different murals. So presumably if you searched for that, you might enjoy that, Micah.
Yeah, well, I've been on that tour a couple of times already.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, I've been back to Belfast maybe 4, 5, 6 times over the last few years. I know Adam, who organises half of those murals, but I think I'll get this one under my belt and then go back to him and say, have you got any space? Oh yeah, I love it. One of my favourite artists, Conor Harrington, is on the side of the Duke of York there. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful piece of work, and the whole of Belfast is changing for the better because of people like Adam putting those works of art up and yeah, slowly changing the narrative, which is for me what it's all about.
Yeah. My husband is from Belfast and I lived over there for a couple of years. That's my connection.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up in a moment. So I'm going to do some thank yous, but while I'm doing that, if our panelists could be thinking of one closing comment, just to sum things up from their perspective, and we'll come back to you again just before we finish. So I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists today for all that they've shared, both of their work and of their thoughts about this issue of art and social change and social impact. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we could have gone on for much longer with it, as I'm sure you appreciate. But we're very grateful to you guys for all coming and sharing today. Thank you to everyone that's been a part of this session and panel. Ben is now dropping information about other HeartEdge events into the chat. So do join us for other things that are coming up in the very near future. But it would be great if we could finish with one final comment from each of our panelists. Nicola, could we start with you?
Yes, I think maybe the greatest discovery or happening that has touched me in my professional journey as a sculptor is the power of the silent space, the safe, almost a space in which my sculptures are almost become mediators, and with the viewer engaging not just with the sculpture but also with the other people around. There's something magical that happens there, and I think, or rhetorical question, but my question is that space something that perhaps we could, as artists, we could really explore?
Thank you. Andre, let's come to you next.
Sure. I mean, there's so many definitions of art. It'll never be pinned down, obviously, but for me, it's about visualizing hope and giving people visuals of things that they may not necessarily believe are existing. You know, when we think of in America, religious movements, we think of conservative right-wing religious movements, but to be able to give people examples of what a progressive left religiosity and ecumenical, where it's across different traditions, that is so important for people to be able to expand their imagination about their relationships to these traditions in contemporary society. So making work that allows people to have options, starting with what is that they sense through their senses, to know that there's different ways of being able to come into relationship with spiritual and political dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go to Hannah for a closing comment. Thank you.
I really agree with the comment about the role of storytelling and the importance of storytelling, because I think that through storytelling, through the medium of art, this can help facilitate understanding and empathy for the complexity of the lives of refugee and marginalized communities. And I think that through art, that art can pierce us and bring us in touch with reality in ways that we cannot forget, and that help enable us to develop a broader and more compassionate consciousness.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah. And Micah, a final thought from you.
Yeah, I think what came to mind was the Mark Twain quote, you can't depend on your eyes if your imagination is out of focus. And I think artists, even today for me, have opened my eyes because my head was somewhere else. So if people are in positions, you know, have spaces on walls or in churches or, you know, inside or outside, they can enable that and facilitate that, then yeah, it can recalibrate our imagination.
Thank you. That's just so many opportunities and so many different ways in which it's possible to engage with the work of artists like these. There's a huge kind of unrealized opportunity, particularly for churches. And our hope is that a session like this will have stirred your imaginations, and through what you've heard from our panel and the information that's been shared in the chat, that there are ideas and links and connections that you can go away and explore. So thank you so much once again to all of our panelists and to you for joining us today. That's where we're going to leave it. There will be a recording of this put on the HeartEdge Facebook page, so do share that and do revisit to remind you of all the inspiring things that have been said in the course of this session. Thank you so much for joining us today, and see you again before too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.